Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session this morning. We're going to be talking about data-driven decision-making. My name is Libby Mason, and I'm an associate partner here at GovX Digital, the transformation publication that is focused on the transformation in government. And we're holding our conference at the moment, which happens twice a year. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to hear from hundreds of leaders and people who are supporting public sector across a range of different challenges and opportunities. So I've got my panel here today, and we're just going to do some quick introductions. Like I said, my name is Libby Mason, and my background, I've been in government, working in and around government for the last 20 years. Originally from Canada, I worked in border services there, and then here in the UK at the Home Office, and now as a consultant supporting government. I'm going to introduce my first panelist here. I'm going to pass it over to Peter, who's going to say hello.
Hi everyone, I'm Peter Toland. I'm a Programme Director with the Scottish Government within the Digital Directorate. My areas of responsibility cover various programmes and platforms covering collaboration, performance, digital publishing, and how all those platforms work together. And that clearly involves how we use data.
Hi everyone, my name is Jim Stamp. I'm here from Maytech. We're a digital delivery service working in the public sector only. Currently, I'm the principal technologist looking after our data capability, helping deliver several data platforms, data science projects, and a couple of other data-related things. Also looking at the internal capability, making sure that we've got the right people in the right place at the right time.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Dorrell. I'm Director of Data Science at the Competition and Markets Authority. I've been here for 3 years, helping set up a new data and analytics and technology unit. Prior to that, I was with Deloitte, and then prior to that, Ministry of Justice in prisons and probation, all the way through focusing on developing, building data capabilities in organisations and delivering products and tools to support decision making.
Hi everyone, I'm Tina Mudumiri. I'm the Head of User and Data Insight for gov.uk at Government Digital Service, where I look after user research, performance analytics, and data science. And our remit is to really support internal and external users with insight generation and personalization. And I came from the private sector, working for Ticketmaster for a number of years as a Senior Director of International Marketing Insight, with a relatively similar remit of maximizing the value and the benefit of our data and feeding it into insight generation and personalization.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here today. Just a few sort of housekeeping points. We will be taking questions throughout the session. So there is a Q&A sort of button at the bottom of your screen, and I really would encourage you to participate, ask questions to the panel as we go through the discussion. We're going to kick off with a question to the audience. So we had a prep session last week, and we had a lot of discussion around a number of things. And one of the topics that we spoke a lot about as a panel was about the sheer volume of data that government holds. And the fact that really, you know, do we even know what we have? Do we know where it is? Can we even access it? So the question really to you as an audience that we'd like to sort of hear your experience, and this is anonymous, so please, please vote as you really feel. And just like to see and understand, do you think that we have enough data, or is it just we need to make better use of what we already have? So I'll give you a few seconds, and panelists, you do get to vote as well.
Already voted.
Me too. I wonder if I can, I know what you voted, Peter, based on our previous discussion. So the results will come up here in a second, and interesting to see what our viewers, our audience members thought about the topic of about data and whether we just aren't doing enough with it. So yeah, we just need to make better use of it. It seems like lots of agreement in that space, that we're just not making use of the data that we do have. So I'm just going to kick it off asking the panel a bit of a question here, because one of the conversations we had in our prep session was around the fact that actually it's you know, yes, data is important, but it's about the insights that it's driving and the questions that we're trying to answer. And I guess, you know, where do you feel like we are in your experience in your organization about understanding the questions that we're really trying to answer? Do users really know what it is that they're trying to do with whatever data we do have, or where the gaps are? I guess, Peter, maybe I'll start with you, because you know, you shared a lot of kind of stuff that you guys are doing in the Scottish Government. It'd be good to hear what you feel about that.
I mean, I've always kind of got a route map in my head, sort of along the line of like data, information, intelligence, actionable outcomes that come from that. And I'm always thinking, if there's no actionable outcomes, why am I doing it? And why am I flowing along that route? And why am I gathering the data? And I think we are starting to smarten up now within government. We've come a long way. We're now starting to realise that the data can be used for very good purposes when we're collecting the correct data and when we're using that data to create the intelligence. And so we're now actually working across different programs, different areas of government to understand the data we've collected. And that kind of emerges from something, we use something called the Scottish approach to service design, where we engage the user right at the beginning. And we get that user involved, and then we explain what we're trying to do, the ways we're trying to do it, seeing how that emerges. But we keep them in the loop the whole way through, and that in a way shapes the kind of data and the intelligence that we're trying to create. And that kind of builds that relationship as you're going through the various programs.
Just to come in, I mean, I completely agree with Peter on this. I mean, any kind of data program should start with the users in the same way a digital program should start with the users, understanding the business problems, the business questions that the users are trying to answer, and from there trying to work out what analytics, what analysis, what algorithms, if you're into data science, you should be developing, and then what data they require, and then that should drive any kind of data quality program, because you should be focusing on the data quality of the data that you need and you use, rather than trying to do some large scale data quality, data improvement program as well. So that starting at the end and working backwards I completely agree with Peter on that, is a critical first step.
And do you feel like users and leadership, you know, within your organization are getting a lot better at sort of being able to be good customers, even internal customers of that kind of a conversation? I think, and Tina, have you found that different coming into government? You know, what
Yes. I was going to say, actually, there's like the flip side of that, right? So it's about improving data literacy as well, and upskilling stakeholders, and making very clear what the benefits and the limitations of data are as well. I think quite often people think that we're going to solve everything with data and we've got all the answers with all the different data points and sources that we have at our fingertips, but it's also about actually managing some expectations, being clear of the caveats, really emphasizing the data quality side of things as well, and thinking about how we use the data to answer those questions. But overall, I'm definitely seeing more of an education piece, and there's definitely some investment from our end as well about bringing people on board, making them more comfortable with what we can and can't do, and kind of taking them along on the journey with us, in order for them to actually, and for us together to realize the value of data. I think, you know, given the pure volume that we do have available, adding that lens as well of like what is actually useful, what can add value, what are we trying to answer, is very, very important. So making it clear to everyone who is a stakeholder of the data that that's something that we should be asking from the outset is happening a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, Jim, it'd be good to hear from you in this, because I think that was one of the things we were talking about in our prep, was around, you were sort of saying, look, as soon as I start working with somebody, there are some ground rules that I just need to get in there and sort of make sure that people understand. And do you feel like people are sort of getting a bit more sort of understanding of the need to do that in order to get to the outcome? You know, there's that lack of impatience, you know.
Yeah, I think those initial use cases, that getting that user value story correct is, as David said, for digital as well as data. I kind of, the split between digital and data is kind of fading over the years. You know, it's no longer data is one thing and digital is another thing. I think we use the same methods and methodologies, and why wouldn't we use the same GDS standards for data that we do for digital? I mean, it works perfectly well, and we should apply the same. And I think over the years, we've seen sort of spreadsheets being fired around organizations, and those days are fading, hopefully. And, you know, as the technologies come on, we can see who's looking at what dashboard, how often, and whether it's being used. We can even start tracking influence and changes in behavior from those as well. So if we can build user research into it, you know, if we design dashboards or data systems or algorithms that are designed to bring around behavioral change, we should be tracking that behavioral change and making sure that the data is having the effect it should do. And that brings in interesting questions. I was going to ask Tina, do you recommend on ethics? You know, it's, can we use the data? There's also the should we use the data question as well. That's always interesting.
Yeah, just on that, and in relation to the initial question that we asked at the very beginning, are we data hoarders? Do we have too much data? I would say in our case, we don't have too much data because we're very careful in what we track and what we store and why. And that's because privacy is very much at the forefront of everything that we do. So we're very careful to be clear on what we're tracking, why, and that there's consent. So that's very, very high on our agenda, which you know, means that we don't have everything that we could be looking at, but there is a reason for that. And then the things that we are looking at, there is a value to it, and it's either for context or for trends or for analysis and so on. So we're very clear about that from the very beginning.
I mean, this brings up such an interesting point around trust, you know, and there's so many dimensions to that trust question around, do we trust our data, whether it's around storage? I mean, David, you know, from your perspective and some of the work that you do, you know, you're working with lots of third parties, I'm sure, around, you know, some of the investigatory work that you need to do at the CMA. I guess, where does that kind of trust agenda come into the conversation, whether it's internal stakeholders trusting that the data is able to give them the insights and information they need, or working, you know, sort of with third parties around getting the data you need in order to be able to do the work you need to do?
I mean, in terms of building trust, in terms of how we handle and we process data, I think Tina's point around where I think government's in a good place is around data protection. I think the role of the ICO, the role of data protection impacts assessments is really critical. And in different organisations I've worked in, seen really good traction in that space. I think security around how we store and process data, for the CMA, when we're dealing with third parties, is critical. And we work very hard. And I think for any organisation that's trying to build up a data analytics capability or expand, getting that alignment right between your IT department, your digital department, but whatever you want to call it, your information security department, and your data analytics department is critical. And from all my experience, you're getting those three parties in around the table at the start before you set out and trying to do anything with data is absolutely vital. And then making sure that you have open and straight up conversations about some of the tensions between, you know, information security, IT security, and data exploitation. Those tensions are there, and they're very real. But if you manage them well, you can get to a good place pretty quickly. The programs I've seen which haven't worked are the ones which you either have someone's trying to set up a data science team or a data analytics team over here, and they start on laptops and MacBooks, and then they try and start doing stuff with data. And then all of a sudden your information security or data protection team get wind of what you're doing, and then there's lots of challenges or questions, or you're trying to move something from a MacBook onto a proper IT platform, and that reverse engineering that takes months or years. And so getting that link up at the start of any program is really, really important. And I mean, I bear the scars and the bald head from having to kind of embark on this about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, you know, that's everybody's sort of been through that, especially where it's, you know, coming from a place of a good intention and wanting to demonstrate that value, you know. So I think that some of those points around being able to demonstrate value then ends up creating more chaos from the beginning. And I think, Peter, when we had our discussion earlier, you were sharing some really interesting stories about that strategy, you know, that strategic narrative right from the top, and some of the things that you're doing around, you know, stopping the proliferation of the data, but actually thinking about how do you start to get data into the right place, you know, and doing some of those hard yards in the beginning.
I think so, and it takes us back again to the point I made about linking data to positive outcomes. I mean, in government, I mean, a lot of things have happened over the last couple of years with the pandemic, for example. And we've asked the public, especially with the data we're collecting, to make a significant leap of faith. I mean, it's almost unthinkable to think that people might be going to a restaurant, sitting with friends, sharing their telephone numbers, admitting where they were, and so they could be tracking and tracing. And there's all this data gathering, data things happening. And it's that sense of, if there's a positive outcome here, we are willing to work with you and we're willing to share that. And it takes you back to the keeping the user in the centre of different things. I mean, I chair something called a chronologies group in Scotland. It's looking at looked after children and vulnerable adults. And these chronologies are used to map out a journey that someone's having if they're being looked after. And it's about building those, and it's about meeting the people whose data is being collected, building a trusting relationship there that says we can be trusted to build this chronology. You can take it through, and then identifying where it's shared. And the more you're building these bridges, the better results you're having. And funnily enough, and we might come on to this, part of the point of collecting the data and working with the data and building the trust is actually letting them know when you will no longer have the data, when you'll have actually destroyed the data, if that's appropriate in a particular situation. And you're seeing a lot of that coming across. I had a quick look at the gov.uk data strategy and how that's taken forward, and that's covering many of these same themes. So we're having a more of a matured engagement with the general public about how we can be trusted with data. Yeah.
I guess one of the things that you know, we've been talking about as well is around sort of how do we separate, you know, out sort of the data from the technology, because we find ourselves, we look at our you know, enterprise architecture, our estate, that we've got this data that's locked into, you know, wherever it's mastered, or mastered might be a generous word in some cases if it's sat on a spreadsheet somewhere. But I guess, Jim, it'd be interesting to get your views on sort of you know, how do you see organizations handling that whole concept around, you know, trying to get that data out from the silos and actually start to use it more effectively?
Yeah, I think the transition from a sort of monolithic data platform to the micro data platform that we're sort of discussing with data mesh is interesting, because that's almost creating silos intentionally. So having that federated view of data products and data governance is quite an interesting model. You know, it's something that we've done pretty quickly with, well, in some areas, pretty quickly with digital, going from those monolith applications to microservices. It's an interesting challenge to how we do that with data. But I think for lots of organizations, creating that monolithic data platform is still an initial step, and probably a required step for some, because it requires a lot of maturity and, to Tina's point, data literacy to expect service areas and teams and product teams to be data literate to the point where they can host their own data platform with a sort of a data mesh equivalent. So yeah, I think the centralized monolith data platform, but with a federated view of those products, is probably the sweet spot that we can hit at the moment with most organizations that we work with. And removing those silos that way is probably the best way of doing it. So making sure that that domain expertise stays with the domain, but the data is shared responsibly with the right access levels and pseudonymization, etc.
I have to say, Jim, when you start talking about monolithic data platforms, I get the heebie-jeebies, and I'm not convinced that any organisation should be aiming for some kind of overall data platform in terms of trying to push all their data into one place. And the days of like data warehouses, and even now, I mean, people talk about data lakes, and we're going to put all our data into a data lake, but actually, unless you know, again, going back to the original point, what you're going to do with your data and why you're going to push it into your platform, and also what data you're bringing on, how good the quality is of that data, you don't achieve very much. And I think your point, I think, is a very good one. This idea of creating the kind of capability to be able to stand up data products, deliver dashboards, deliver insight algorithms into operational processes is a really good one. But you should do that in that federated way and build off a sort of underlying architecture or underlying infrastructure, but not try and push all your data into one platform.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. It is that way sort of problems lie. You know, we found the same in the digital domain. It doesn't work, it doesn't scale, and it isn't feasible. I think the only counter to it is just the level of data maturity that is required for smaller organizations to scale to distributed data platforms. I think that's the only, there is a sweet spot. There is a necessary centralization of the technology at times, even if it's not a centralization of the processes.
I guess just question to the panel, do you feel like there's enough alignment of those different skills coming together, sort of the data scientists, the data analysts, the people who are trying to answer the questions, and sort of more that infrastructure, IT, digital strategy layer where you're sort of saying, okay, well, how are we actually going to get this all to operate? What's that interoperability agenda that they're bringing in?
I can jump quickly in on that just because, again, it was relatively new for gov.uk and GDS that we brought some of these disciplines together into one team, specifically to break down those silos. There's so much overlap in those areas. And, you know, when you're looking at the data source itself and thinking about how you can use it, again, what the limitations are, what the caveats are, and so forth, and how far you can go with A/B testing or with creating a model or a score around it, for example, I think is quite important. So we've brought all of that into one kind of team and one remit. And we've developed a really strong partnership with the tech community as well in order for us to kind of maybe remove some blockers or jointly make some decisions on what we want to progress and how and why, again. So one of the other really important strands that we've been focusing on, going back to the question around trust, but internal trust of the data itself. So a number of people across the team and across the disciplines looking at the quality at source and how we can actually improve that, whether it's questions that we ask on the website, for example, and the wording around that, whether it's tracking through Google Analytics, for example, and really trying to increase our confidence in those data sources as well. And I think that we've only been able to really do that by bringing together the different disciplines, thinking about how we're answering the questions and how those kind of data sources help us do that and how we need to invest in improving that to begin with.
Can I just jump in on the data quality bit? I think that's the interesting flip side to the trust, the internal trust versus the external trust. We've talked about the external trusting, how we handle data, but your point about data quality and confidence and trustworthiness of data is so important. And one of the things that we found through the work that I've done over the years of seeing how we're applying more and more software engineering processes to data to bring in unit testing, to bring in quality testing, to bring in contract testing. There's nothing worse than building an ML pipeline that dies 2 weeks later because someone's changed something 4 steps down the pipeline. It just ruins everything. And at that point, people lose trust in that data set and that process. And if it's on an operational service, it's even worse because then you've got users losing trust in your ability to keep the data up to date. And so I think, you know, building in those really good processes and practices is vital.
Yeah, could I jump in there? I mean, we've been working quite closely with the Dutch government and about keeping data sources accurate and up to date. I mean, they don't collect any information that they already have, so they're always checking their existing data to make sure they're not repeating it. But one of the other interesting things is that also, if someone's thinking of creating a database, they check to see if anyone else has a database they can reuse. And they do that because if there's multiple users of databases, it's easier to keep it accurate and current. And I was at a meeting only a few weeks back where someone was looking at a new initiative that they're launching about ventilation and things. That's really not important, but their initial question was, is anyone already collecting this information? Which meant that they weren't setting up yet another separate database. And you do see that maturity coming through.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, this kind of internal trust in data, because I mean, from other organizations I've worked in, I mean, echoing Peter's point, that the worst case scenario is someone wants to start a new policy or start a new program, and they say, okay, well, we'll just set up a new data collection in order to get the information we need, and then, or if they look at what's already been collected, they say, oh, that's not good quality data, so I'll start a new data collection to try and get better quality data. And then you end up with even worse data. And so really that kind of making sure that you've got that discipline around collecting your data once, one version of the truth, is really important. And then this use of data. And previously in the prison service, I pushed very strongly to say, if we're collecting this data and we don't think it is high quality, we need to demonstrate why this data is important, push it back into the operational business to say, actually, you want to know about this problem area or this issue, this is where the data comes from, you need to be able to collect this data properly, and then we will do the work for you to give you the reports and the insights to allow you to run your business better. And you get into that positive cycle, which we did with prisons really well, that actually drive up data quality. It's a reinforcing virtuous cycle when it works well, and people can see the value. You need to make sure that the people entering the data into whatever database you've got see the value of that data. It's not just a case of head office wants us to collect this data, so I'll just keep putting it in, and it doesn't really matter whether I get it right or wrong. So that virtuous cycle of using the data, exploiting it, playing it back, giving value back to the people in the front line who are collecting it is really important.
I think that's such an important point, David. I mean, I think all of us throughout our career have been in that sort of thing. And I mean, we talked a little bit about that, about the question of data ownership and data governance, and, who's responsible for, whose job is it anyway to keep data up to date. And I think, your point there about it's who's going to benefit from that reinforcement needs to be made. It'd be interesting. We were talking about this a little bit in our prep around, particularly around citizens' data, and what role do citizens or, organizations play in keeping their own data up to date? I guess, do you see that, whether that being government's role or it's, putting that back onto the citizens is something that, well, it's your data. Do you see a role for them in that space?
Well, I'll just jump in there. There's definitely a role for the customer to be controlling their own data. I mean, it is their data after all. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at with identity programs within Scottish Government, this idea of the customer owns the data and then shares with the various organisations that they want to share that information with. And it's a very good way of making sure that the data is then kept current and accurate, because there is an ownership there of that data. That's not to say that won't spill into other related sort of data collections and different things as you're processing the information, but it should always start with the customer.
I would just add that what's really important here is, again, consent, transparency and choice, that they know what they're opting into, that they know what benefits they'd get if they do opt in, that they know how, it's being used and so on. So as long as that's, again, top of mind and at the forefront of the communications with our users, I think they will trust government to handle it responsibly as well. And from all the user research that we have done, there is a very strong kind of support in that, that, generally speaking, I think users trust government to handle their data securely and safely and to not kind of abuse it. So I think that relationship needs to become more of a partnership, and I think that's the direction that it's moving into as well, and transparency is very, very key there.
I think the distributed ownership of data, so, as we've all said, it's the users that own the data and we just take advantage of it and, use it to help them get better services, etc. So I think there's some really interesting sort of ideas with sort of pods, etc. coming out where users hold their own data and allow organizations to have access to it. and it's sort of the electronic patient records and sort of the equivalent there with your personal records stored on your phone that are shared with your GP, etc. So there's some interesting changes happening where that decentralized nature of data being owned and maintained and held by the people who are responsible for it ultimately. It's my data. I should choose who I share it with. And also, as you said, Tina, it's the consent of how it can be used. You know, sort of I consent to this being used in this way is so important. Rather than I consent for you to have this data is one thing versus it should be used in this way is another thing completely.
I'm just going to remind the audience, we've got about 15 minutes left. So if you do have any Q&A questions that you wanted to pose to the panel, then feel free to pop those into the Q&A question box, and Bethany will feed those through to us. I mean, I think, is that, you know, David, just on your point about value, is, you know, are we making that case clear then to citizens, you know, for example, around the role that they need to be playing, but also the benefit that they would receive back in terms of, you know, of how they would benefit from taking a more proactive role in their data. And when we talk, I remember one of the conversations we were having, it was about, you know, there was an assumption that we were actually sharing data more effectively across services, and that people were surprised that, you know, that there were such silos taking place within government. And well, I told you this, how is it you're not connecting the dots? And do we need to be able to maybe do some of those things more effectively to be able to make that value case back out to citizens around, you know, our ability to use their data?
Yeah, well, I think your point is absolutely right. There is a, for the citizen, I mean, the fact the government doesn't share data in certain situations, or can't share data, or won't, for that matter, I think people find it very surprising. Is why aren't we connecting these data points up, and whether that's in criminal investigations or through to actually positive stories like Peter was talking around child outcomes. And I think for me, this always comes back to transparency. You know, it should be this transparency, being sort of open and straight about how government is using data, how at an individual level, this is how your data is going to be used. It's a critical enabler to doing that. The other critical enabler, which I don't think from a kind of broadly kind of UK government perspective we've got right, is the sort of the legal gateways for organisations to share data aren't clear, and often they're kind of you're particularly reliant on particular clauses within like discrete bits of legislation from 1996 or whatever, and it's very hard for policy people, for data people, to really understand, do we have the right to share this data? And I think I know the Cabinet Office have looked at this and they're continuing to look at it, but I think it needs a real kind of push to say, actually, how are we going to facilitate the sharing of data across government as in legislation, and make the understanding within government about what is allowed and what isn't allowed really clear and transparent, because I don't think we're there yet.
It's always easier to not share. You know,
yeah.
in a risk-based society, it's always easier not to share. And some of the issues and walls that we've had to break down when trying to build those coordinated data sets, it comes down to one or two people within the organization whose name is on the line if something goes wrong. And it's easier to say no than it is to say yes.
Can I just add something around the sharing? I think in addition to that, I think perhaps we might want to think about standardization to a certain extent as well, because I think the data is, again, collected in so many different ways, and the metrics might mean different things, and we have different definitions. So if we were to do more sharing across departments and across government, I think there should be some level of standardization that would allow some sort of benchmarking as well, and so on. So it feels like it's a space that needs quite a lot of looking into on a number of different areas as well. So it's not just like enabling the data sharing itself, but it's like, what can we do with that different data across the board, and how can it be joined up, and how can we take advantage of it and, you know, get value out of it?
I think that open data standards are an interesting way of driving that. You know, we've seen it with sort of the fire protocols for the NHS and some of the housing protocols for local government. I don't think they're there. I don't think they're quite ready for people to adopt wholeheartedly. But I also think a lot of vendors don't want to use them because it removes their ability to lock people in. And I think government procurement needs to get a lot smarter when it comes to data. And I think that sharing will only happen when we start purchasing software that allows us to share data. We've seen that over and over again with our customers. They just can't get access to their own data. They're being blocked from getting access to it. That's verging on the side of just bad actor. It's quite a poor way of dealing with your customers, I feel. Anyway.
If I could just jump in, I think sometimes, as others have said, it's a bit of a misunderstanding. And we've certainly found that having the ICO in early doors when you're having these discussions helps to clarify your positioning in the way you're maybe sharing information and data and what you're trying to achieve. And it definitely helps having, again, say the ICO at the table, or at least informed, because if you're then making the mistakes together, they're less dangerous and less damaging. So you are working through the process, and then there's lots for people to learn. I think sometimes you go down the road, then the ICO gets involved at the very last minute, and then things maybe haven't panned out the way they should. And again, it's a communication. If you're doing the early communications, then you get there a lot quicker and it's a lot safer.
Yeah, I mean, I think nice of you to call out our fellow regulators. But I think engagement with the ICO, it's a similar point to the one I was making earlier, at a smaller scale, even like engaging with your data protection officer and your information security officers early, so there are no surprises. You get the advice from the people who know about that thing, is really important. But I think this kind of positive can-do attitude, and this kind of Jim's point, is easier to say no, is something that we need to drive more. And I think there's a question in the chat around sort of examples of good sharing, and I think the more we can collect those examples of good sharing and share them across government and be clear that you can do this safely and securely is something that we should be pushing.
I think that things like the pandemic, I mean, in another panel discussion that I was on, you know, we were hearing examples about DWP and the NHS sharing data, and the NHS, you know, needing something to be able to target you know, some of the COVID response, that DWP was holding that data, and that sort of a catalyst event like the pandemic sort of really broke down those barriers, and there was that sort of need in that space. I guess outside of that, do you see that those are the kinds of things that need to happen for them people to say, well, actually that was okay and that was good, and we got a lot of benefit from it?
Ironically, from a local authority point of view, a lot of the data sharing that was put in place as part of the pandemic has now been rewound because it wasn't seen as necessary. And so a lot of those principles that were put in place that people found useful have now been removed because there's no longer a need for them. And so, you know, those conduits, even if we just think about the conduits that need to be set up, have been removed, never mind the data that was shared across them. So yeah, it's strange seeing the changes that the pandemic brought about, and they weren't as sticky as we hoped they would be, I think.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
I find that quite shocking, actually. You would have thought that, you know, it wouldn't have been rolled back, but sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, one of the things we're doing in government is we're trying to make things sticky, a bit like what's been said there, that we're trying to maintain the things that were actually really beneficial and put in place. Just from a personal point of view, I mean, I was actually hospitalised with COVID, and I found it astonishing how well they were sharing my information between two separate hospitals, my GP and the research arm of the hospital, when they were doing all the work. And I literally felt like I was at the centre of all the things that were happening because everyone was informing me what was going on. And it was so different from my experiences 5 or 6 years back with something else where nothing seemed to be getting shared, or if it was getting shared, no one was telling me. And I think during the COVID, that for me felt like a very positive thing. And I would really hate to think that had been removed. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that quite startling, Jim, actually, that, you know, because I feel like there's some things that, you know, you almost need, you know, an event like the pandemic to kind of get people to let go of certain things and to say, well, we wouldn't do this otherwise, but, you know, because it's such a national, you know, requirement, we're going to allow ourselves some leeway here. And then actually, when you get into it, you say, well, actually, we can trust this. It is safe. We've got value from this. So let's figure out a way to keep this in place. We've just got a few minutes left before we need to wrap, and I guess I just wanted to ask sort of the panel if you had any last minute sort of words of wisdom, advice. You know, what did you find has been the biggest thing? Peter, what do you?
I'm going on about volumes of data. Just from the point of view, we had this discussion literally yesterday, and it's because COP26 is up in Glasgow. So it's like a very, very topical thing. And they were throwing around numbers, and I don't know if anybody else sort of realizes these numbers, but apparently they're predicting there'll be 175 zettabytes of data by 2025. Now, I didn't understand what that meant. I mean, I was like, what do you mean by that? And the people who were sharing the information were saying, well, imagine you were sitting in front of your computer and you wanted to download it. How long do you think it would take to download? Now, I was thinking like 100 years, 200 years, 1.8 billion years. That's the kind of scale of this. And the point they were making was, we're storing all that information in data centers that are burning energy, and it's just going on and on and on. And they were telling us about a data center in America that's now built inside a power station. It was a decommissioned coal power station that's now been recommissioned, running on coal, so it can store all this data. And that's happening more and more around the world. So I go back to my original point about, we need to be thinking about just how much data we're collecting and storing, because this can't go on forever. It's just, there's got to be an end point where we say enough's enough, or we've got to find a different way of storing it. Sorry, I'll get off my hobby horse now.
No, but that's really it. I mean, I know you're experiencing COP at the moment. You know, it's right in front and center. But it's a great sort of dimension to this discussion. Even is that we're talking about carbon footprint and supply chains and all sorts of things like that. But it's now going to be something that actually what's the cost across a number of dimensions around data storage. And it's not just, well, how much does it cost me to get more? It's not like my iCloud account that I keep upping my my storage on. There's a real kind of environmental cost to data proliferation.
Sorry, not to just grab the whole thing here, but the point that I'm making was, if this was still getting stored in places like libraries, someone would have stopped in by now and put an end to this and said, that's unacceptable. But because it's out of sight, it just goes on.
No, that's so true. That's so true.
I think the compute costs also aren't factored in. I think if you think about the cost involved in training a neural network, deep learning, etc., the costs involved in that are absolutely phenomenal when it comes to a sort of carbon, energy, etc. And I think that there does need to be, as well as some data ethics and data usage ethics, I think we need to start thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it from a point of view of, is this actually necessary? Is this the right way of doing it? Is there a different way of learning about this system rather than just throwing compute at it? I think that's an interesting point.
I think this environmental point is a really interesting one, and I fully agree with my fellow panelists on the fact that we need to really think about the costs of storage and compute data, especially when we're now so many organizations are working within a kind of public cloud environment where you just don't see that physical tin anymore. That said, just as a positive bent, I think data and data-informed decision-making has the potential to really positively impact the environmental situation in terms, not just in terms of like data exploitation and direct consequences, but better decision-making, more efficient use of resources, whether that's running logistics better and cleaner. There are the benefits of organizations holding good quality data and making better decisions off the back of it for the environment are real as well. So I think there's a positive bent for us as we think about climate change too.
Tina, did you want to say anything to wrap up the discussion before we close out the call?
No, I guess just to link it back to, I think, what Peter said at the very beginning about like the kind of hierarchy of data needs and usage as well. So if we start with the foundations and the infrastructure and getting that right, then moving on to the reporting and analysis and insight, but always thinking about the actionability side of things, whether it's for government or for climate change or for whatever use case we have. I think as long as we're always thinking about that endpoint in sight, I think then we're in a good place, and we should just continue thinking in those terms and pushing that along, that agenda along.
Well, I think that's a great way to end the discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists for your insight and sharing your experience, and thanks to everybody who joined in today. And hopefully you'll join us for another discussion throughout the coming weeks. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.